convidamos para compor a mesa o reitor da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, professor Jaime Arturo Ramires.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Bom dia, gente. Melhorou? É uma satisfação dar início às atividades desta semana que encerram o ciclo de conferências UFMG, 90 anos, Desafios Contemporâneos. Nós teremos nesta semana 2 palestras e eu já gostaria de estender o convite também para a atividade de quinta-feira, que será aqui neste mesmo auditório, no mesmo horário. E daqui a pouco nós passamos mais informações em relação a essa atividade. Ao longo do ano de 2017, como o vídeo mostrou, a Universidade comemorou seus 90 anos e nós tivemos a oportunidade de convidar pesquisadores, escritores, cientistas das mais diversas áreas que foram sugeridos por colegas da nossa comunidade universitária e que nos brindaram, nos presentearam com palestras e um pouco da sua obra e, sobretudo, da sua sabedoria. E na manhã desta terça-feira, nós teremos a grande satisfação de receber o professor Peter Burke, da Inglaterra. Eu vou fazer as honras da casa exclusivamente para saudá-los, mas vou convidar a professora Juliana Gamboge para compor a mesa comigo e fazer a apresentação do professor Peter Burke. Professora Juliana, por favor.
Bom dia. Bom, é uma alegria para a UFMG e é uma honra para mim apresentar a vocês o convidado que, como o Jaime confirmou, é o penúltimo desse ciclo de conferências feito para comemorar os 90 anos dessa nossa casa, o professor Peter Burke. O professor Peter Burke é doutor em História pela Universidade de Oxford, foi professor em Princeton, nos Estados Unidos, e atualmente é professor emérito da Universidade de Cambridge, na Inglaterra. Foi também professor visitante do Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Universidade de São Paulo, onde desenvolveu o projeto de pesquisa intitulado Duas Crises de Consciência Histórica. Especialista em teoria da história e do conhecimento, Burke enfatiza em suas análises a relevância dos aspectos socioculturais. Essa é uma breve apresentação que eles tiveram a generosidade de nos mandar, ao qual eu quero acrescentar um pouco do que representa esse convidado hoje para nós. O professor tem mais de 28 livros publicados e traduzidos para 31 idiomas. Em português brasileiro, e sem qualquer pretensão em ser exaustiva, destaco alguns títulos que dão uma ideia meio pálida da produção intensa e rica do nosso convidado. A Fabricação do Rei, Cultura Popular na Idade Moderna, Linguagens e Comunidades nos Primórdios da Europa, O que é a História do Conhecimento, A Escola dos Annales, a Revolução Francesa da Historiografia, Uma História do Conhecimento, em 2 volumes, História e Teoria Social, com a professora Maria Lúcia Palhares Burke, que vai fechar o nosso ciclo de conferências na quinta-feira, neste mesmo horário, neste mesmo local, aqui presente. Ele também assina Os Ingleses, Repensando os Trópicos, um retrato intelectual de Gilberto Freire. Produção, portanto, prolífica, de um autor, se ele me permite o abuso da interpretação do título, polímata, mas sempre marcado por um rigor que nunca abandona o compromisso com a clareza e com a transmissão. É por essa razão, são essas as razões pelas quais eu só posso me sentir muito honrada e muito feliz em dar boas-vindas ao professor Peter Burke.
Bom dia. Infelizmente não posso falar muito bem português, então vai ter uma tradução do meu inglês. Mas vou dizer antes de começar que estou muito feliz de participar nessa celebração. Bom, in the last few decades, as you may know, some historians have been taking increasing interest in what they call the history of knowledge. It's an approach to the past, almost a new sub-discipline that has developed out of the history of science. It now occupies a place on the academic map somewhere between intellectual history, social history, and cultural history. In fact, the phrase cultures of knowledge is now current in English, and similarly in German, Wissenskulturen. And in France, they talk about savoir in the plural. Indeed, 2 large volumes have been published in French under the title Lieu de savoir, a kind of historical geography of knowledge. And I think the rise of this new sub-discipline should not surprise us. New approaches to the past are usually responses to changes in the present. This is particularly obvious in the case of environmental history. So our anxiety about the future of the planet translates into debates about what to do now, and that inspires historians, as usual, to ask, are these anxieties new? Has there been a debate before our generation about what happens to the environment? I think this is one of the great functions of historians, to place current problems in a perspective of the long term. And in similar fashion to the history of the environment, the history of knowledge is responding to current debates about the knowledge economy, about the information society that we live in today. In fact, today's anxieties about the glut of information, or the flood, or even the tsunami of information. The problem, there is too much to know. The problem, as historians are now saying, of information overload. It may be particularly acute today, but it is not a new problem. Similar worries have been expressed in the last 300 or 400 years. And in what follows, I should like to argue that there have been 3 principal crises of knowledge. The first occurred in Europe in the 17th century. The second in the West in the 19th century. And the third crisis, which we are experiencing today, is on a global scale. And each of these crises, I believe, was linked to a revolution in communication. The first crisis was a delayed response to the invention of printing, more exactly the reinvention of printing in the 15th century. But it seems that only in the 17th century do people really become anxious about there being too much to know. The 19th century crisis occurred when journals and newspapers were proliferating. And today our worries are very much connected to the digital revolution and the rise of the internet. Each of these crises has made it more difficult for anybody to become a polymath, that is, an individual who has mastered several academic disciplines. In the Middle Ages and even the Renaissance, there was no serious problem. To master many disciplines might even be described as the default setting for scholars. Of course, some individuals, from Thomas Aquinas to Leonardo da Vinci, knew more than their colleagues, but still, this variety of interests was normal. But in the 17th century, I think for the first time, this kind of mastery was becoming a difficult achievement. Now, new words are often signs of changes in the wider culture and society. The term polymath, although it existed in ancient Greece, it only came into general use in the 17th century, in Latin, in German, in French, in English. But at this time, the good news is a substantial number of polymaths were still to be found both in Europe and beginning in the New World. And within this group, a few intellectual giants, once described vividly by a Dutch scholar as monsters of erudition, a few of these people existed. They stand out for their range. In the first place, on the screen, Isaac Newton. Now, the fact that we remember these giants for only a small proportion of their achievements says something about our culture, not about theirs. So take the case of Newton. His contributions to mathematics, optics, mechanics, and astronomy are still well known. But Newton had many other interests. He was a student of alchemy, of theology, and maybe above all of chronology. He attempted, like other scholars, to reconcile ancient Greek and Roman chronologies with the Bible, with Arab chronology, and so on. And Newton's great rival in the study of calculus, maybe this one. So I waved my arm. Now, it's that one. That's okay. Thank you. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. People remember him today as a philosopher, but he was much more than that. He made important contributions to the study of medieval history, comparative linguistics, law, theology. People knew in his own time that he was an expert on China, but they didn't know what his manuscripts reveal, his interests in astronomy, botany, geology, and medicine. A third monster, almost forgotten today, except by a few specialists in the cultural history of the 17th century, the German Jesuit, Athanasius Kircher. He wrote on subjects as different as ancient Egypt, China, acoustics, optics, language, fossils, magnetism, music, mathematics, mining, and finally he wrote a book about universal knowledge, Scientia Universalis. And a few polymaths can already be found in the New World in the 17th century. In Mexico, Carlos Sigüenza y Góngora, professor of mathematics and astronomy in the University of Mexico, was also active as a geographer, cartographer, and a historian. He was inspired by Kircher, and he adopted Kircher's theory that the Mexicans were descended from the ancient Egyptians. In Peru, a little later, turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, a rector of the University of Lima, Pedro de Peralta, was active as a mathematician, astronomer, but also a historian and a poet. And a few 17th century women overcame the obstacles that society put in their way and became learned ladies, if not exactly monsters of erudition. One of the most celebrated of these learned ladies was the Mexican nun, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. When she was young, Sor Juana even wanted to go to the University of Mexico, which she would have had to do dressed like a man. She failed in this ambition, but she succeeded in learning Latin and Nahuatl. She wrote poetry. She wrote about philosophy. She accumulated a large library, as you can see, though the books were later sold and the money given to the poor. So, looking backwards from our time, the age of these monsters appears to be a kind of golden age of polymaths. But there was already a dark side to the 17th century. You may be surprised that the consequences of the Gutenberg Revolution took so long, but complaints that there is too much to know really begin in the 17th century. And the problem of information overload was not simply the multitude of books. More and more new information was becoming available in the 17th century, thanks to two processes in particular. In the first place, a great increase in European knowledge of Asian, African, and American languages, histories, animals, plants, rocks, and so on, thanks, of course, to the discovery, not to say the invasion of other continents. But the second process of discovery was also very important, what we now call the scientific revolution, and in part the result of the invention of the telescope and the microscope, each of which gave access, like the discoveries, to a new world of knowledge, either very small or very far away. So I'm tempted to speak of an explosion of knowledge in the 17th century. I think this metaphor is appropriate because it combines two meanings. In the first place, rapid expansion, and in the second place, fragmentation. A fragmentation that 17th century scholars are already beginning to lament, notably the Czech reformer of education, Jan Amos Comenius. What he wanted was pansophia, that is, putting all the fragments together again. So retrospectively, the rise of that new word polymath in the 17th century looks more like a bad sign than a good sign. It means wide-ranging learning can no longer be taken for granted. You have to fight for it. And there's another sign of crisis, because there is an increasing critical attitude to at least some polymaths. Returning to Kircher, for example, he was described by one of his contemporaries, no less a figure than René Descartes, as a charlatan. In other words, somebody who made promises he could not perform. Just like those people who sold miraculous medicines on the piazza in Italy and elsewhere. Since that time, the word charlatan has often been used to deflate the pretensions of scholars with wide interests. And this point I'll come back to in a few minutes when I reach the 20th century. And now on to the 18th. So I think 17th and 18th centuries, they're a time of a gradual intellectual retreat, a narrowing of interests. But polymaths did not disappear. During the Enlightenment, some individuals were still able to master a number of disciplines, even if they did not make original contributions to each of them. The intellectual ideal of the period was the man of letters, not in a narrow sense of literature, but in the sense of man of learning, or sometimes woman of learning. Think, for example, of Denis Diderot. So, have to go back. That's it. It's this one. Got it. Thank you. Diderot was able to edit the famous Encyclopédie because his own interests were encyclopedic. He wrote several hundred articles for the Encyclopédie. He didn't just edit it. He wrote on philosophy and literature, his favorite subjects, but also on acoustics, on biology, on music, and so on. And unusually, even in his day, Diderot wrote about the knowledge, the practical knowledge of artisans. He respected the know-how of craftsmen. His father was one. His father made cutlery, knives, forks, and so on. But specialization was already visible at this time. Diderot talks about it, especially in the sphere of medicine, where it's natural to specialize in different illnesses or in different parts of the body. And another revealing contrast. In the 17th century, it had still been possible for an individual scholar to compile an encyclopedia by himself. But the French Encyclopédie had at least 139 different contributors. So knowledge is being divided up. And by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, signs of the second crisis are becoming visible. Again, the problem of overload. There were many scientific expeditions bringing back all kinds of new knowledge together with specimens of plants, with stuffed animals, specimens of rocks, and so on. The production of printed matter was increasing at an incredible rate around the year 1800, thanks partly to the steam press and partly to a fall in the price of paper, which used to be made from rags, and it was expensive, and now it was made from wood pulp, much cheaper. That's the background, or part of the background, to the rise of the periodical press, journals, newspapers. Information anxiety revived. And in the middle of the 19th century, a major change in the world of the universities. The proliferation of specialized institutes or departments. The traditional medieval or Renaissance university had very few faculties. Simply arts, theology, law, medicine. And now you have scores of independent departments. I believe that one explanation for this, another one is competition between professors, but that's not part of my story today. I believe that the multiplication of departments was partly a defense mechanism. If you like, the walls of academic institutes were like dikes erected to keep out the flood of information, or at least to contain it. Unfortunately, the walls of departments also contributed, still do, to isolate the workers in each discipline from their neighbors. They don't realize what they have in common. And as I suggested earlier, new words are signs of new trends. In English, the word scientist was coined in the year 1834. In other words, people studying nature were beginning to see themselves as separate. They have a separate identity from their colleagues who were studying culture. In France, in the early 19th century, a cluster of new words, spécialité, spécialiste, spécialisation. First, they appear once again in the context of medicine, but then they spread to one discipline after another. And the meaning of the old phrase, man of letters, it was shrinking. It was now coming to refer only to belles lettres, what we call literature. And by the end of the 19th century, teams of workers were beginning to replace individual researchers in the natural sciences. In Germany, teamwork in the laboratory was a major feature of what the Germans called Großwissenschaft. That is, big science, but the term in English only goes back to the 1940s. In Germany, where they were pioneering this approach, goes back to 1900. The collective production of knowledge was already being compared by critics to mass production of goods in factories. I should say, I do not mean to suggest that specialization is in itself an evil. In fact, we need specialization. Many discoveries would not have been made without it, including many discoveries that produce benefits to mankind in the sphere of health and so on. Only specialization has a price. Specialization has a dark side, a negative side, because it flourishes at the expense of general knowledge. But the good news is, in spite of this trend towards the division of intellectual labor, a remarkable number of 19th century scholars were still able to make discoveries in a number of different fields. Many of them because they'd gone to university before the universities divided up into so many departments. The most famous example of this variety, Alexander von Humboldt. He was a true monster of erudition in the 17th century style. His contributions to knowledge, many of them the result of his 4-year trip to South America, were spread among so many disciplines I can hardly name them all. Geography, geology, botany, zoology, anatomy, astronomy, and then on the side of the humanities, archaeology, demography, not to mention various social and political observations contained in Humboldt's account of his travels. But at this time, as specialization was increasing, this kind of achievement was attracting criticism as well as admiration. Humboldt once remarked that people complained about him, that he was interested in too many things at once. Instead of being proud of it, people were suspicious of it. Again, a member of my Cambridge College at the end of the 18th century, who practiced as a physician but wrote about physics, Egyptology, and other subjects. He made sure to publish on these other subjects anonymously. He was afraid that his colleagues, and maybe his patients as well, would not take him seriously as a doctor if they knew he was so interested in other things. So that's a big change. So now I move into the early 20th century. One might have expected that when the universities were divided and subdivided into so many institutes, then the polymath would disappear. But the good news is that they continued. Paradoxically, the polymath became a kind of specialist. That is, the person that specializes in connecting different parts of the fragmented world of knowledge. In other words, they became generalists. And that's another new word which is, I think, significant, coined in English at the end of the 19th century. It was famously used of himself by Patrick Geddes, a Scottish polymath active at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Geddes was what I'd like to call a serial polymath on the model of serial polygamy. That is, he would take up one subject, master it, but then drop it, move on to another one. So he started in biology. Actually, then he had a problem with his eyesight. He couldn't look down a microscope, and he moved into another field. And he found himself working in sociology. But he was interested in connections, so he called what he was doing biosociology. He was particularly interested in cities, wrote a great deal about them. And he saw cities as a kind of organism. He wanted to see the organism as a whole and also its relation to its environment, that is, the city viewed together with its region. And when he was living in Edinburgh, he did something very revealing, that he had a tower constructed, so that he could look at the whole city from a height. We might say that this tower, which was named the Outlook Tower, symbolized his desire for an overview, not only of the city, but of the world of knowledge. In general, serial polymaths notice unexpected connections because they acquire an intellectual habitus in their first discipline. And then they move into another field, but they're looking at that field with eyes that were trained in the first discipline. Several famous examples of this began their career as engineers. This is the Italian Vilfredo Pareto, his first discipline, civil engineering, and his first employment on the Italian railways. And then he moved into economics and finally into sociology. But he took some intellectual baggage with him, notably the idea of equilibrium, physical equilibrium, then economic equilibrium, and finally social equilibrium. Yeah, I can't resist here a personal anecdote. When I was teaching at the University of Sussex, which was a deliberately interdisciplinary university, I made friends with the professor of biology, John Maynard Smith. And he told me once that if he had been successful in biology, the reason was that he had not studied biology as an undergraduate. He read engineering at Cambridge. When he moved, then he became fascinated by biology, but he looked at problems with the eyes of an engineer. He wrote his PhD on evolution of the flight of birds, but he looked at the flight of birds as a trade-off between the need for stability on one side, the need for maneuverability on the other. And that allowed him to see things which the professional biologists had not yet noticed. Now, I already mentioned, I think, the beginnings in the 19th century of a division between two cultures, the culture of the natural sciences and the culture of the humanities. That word scientist, coined in 1834, is one sign of the split. But in the 20th century, I don't need to tell you, this gap became much wider than before. So it's really quite extraordinary that a small number of individuals were able to cross this frontier and to make original contributions on both sides. I want to quote two extremely remarkable examples, one from Austria and one from Russia. Sorry, I need to go back again. Number one, this is Otto Neurath, and he was active as a philosopher, as an economist, as a museum director, as an inventor, and as a minister in the short-lived Socialist Republic of Austria in 1919. He spent much of his life on one goal, an attempt to restore the lost unity of knowledge. He pursued this goal by organizing international congresses, founding a journal and an institute, and planning a new encyclopedia that was inspired by the French encyclopédie. You often find this. One polymath is inspired by an earlier polymath, sometimes centuries earlier. When the Nazis took over Austria in 1938, Neurath became a refugee in England. As a result, he began to write in English, and he called his project The Unity of Science. But when he was writing in German, he called it Einheitswissenschaft, much wider, unity of knowledge. He included sociology, history, not just the natural sciences. Now we come to the next one. So it's the man on the left in the cassock is Paweł Florensky. Now, he wrote of himself that his life's task, rather like Neurath, was to follow the path to what he called a future integral worldview. He began his polymathic career as a mathematician. Then he turned to the study of philosophy and theology, and as you see, he became a Russian Orthodox priest. But in the seminary, he began to study Russian icons. So that involved the insights of an art historian, but true to the tradition of the serial polymath, he looked at Russian icons with the eyes of a geometrician as well as an Orthodox priest. He became interested in the representation of space in the icon. Mathematics also led him in a completely different direction, and that is electrical engineering. Of course, by this time, the Bolshevik Revolution had occurred. And as you know, after the revolution, there was great enthusiasm for electrification in Russia. Some parents went so far as to call their daughters electrificatia. So these skills of Florensky were really useful. One day, he gave a paper at a conference on electrification, still wearing that cassock, to the great surprise of Trotsky, who was also at the conference. Well, in that period, he could survive. Under Stalin, he was arrested in one of the purges. He was eventually shot, but before that, in prison, he was discovering a totally new subject. He was working on the production of iodine from seaweed. So a really many-sided man. At this point, I think, the early years of the 20th century, I can turn to Brazil, and in the same generation as Neurath and Florensky, Gilberto Freire. You could say his intellectual ambitions were a little bit more modest than theirs. Freire was what I would like to call a clustered polymath, that is, somebody who masters several disciplines which are obviously connected. In his case, mainly history, sociology, anthropology. Not, of course, only those. He was extremely interested in psychology, including social psychology. He was interested in geography and what we now call ecology. writing that pioneering book, Nordestgy, on the history of the environment in Pernambuco. At this time, almost nobody is writing the history of the environment, and very much concerned with the destruction of that environment by the sugar factories, which are leading to deforestation and the pollution of rivers like the Capibaribe. As you know, this Omem Orchestra, a phrase that he liked to use about other people. Freire also wrote poems, he wrote novels, he was a deputy in Congress, he was a painter. But he preferred to describe himself as a man of letters. I believe it's appropriate to speak about the survival of this cultural type in Latin America at a time when it was beginning to become obsolete in Europe, unfortunately, owing to growing professionalization. A more recent example of the man of letters, who is a polymath, that's, as you know, that's Gilberto Darcy Ribeiro now, who was incidentally an admirer of Freire. So Darcy, a professional anthropologist, but the author of books on history, the author of novels, sometime Minister of Education, he can hardly be accused of specialization. And Darcy takes us into the second half of the 20th century. And once again, one might have expected the polymath to have become extinct by this time, but happily, examples remain. So I move to the next one, Susan Sontag. She illustrates yet another kind of polymath. As you see, polymaths are splitting into different specialities of their own. And the one that she represents best is the cultural critic. She began her career by studying and then teaching literature and philosophy. Remarkably, she did this simultaneously in the same universities. But then she left the academic world because the academic world of the 1950s was too narrow for her interests. She became interested in photography, cinema, popular culture, at a time when they didn't yet have a place in the usual academic curricula. She wrote novels and plays, she directed films, she commented on current affairs, but she remains best known, I think, for her essays, 6 or 7 volumes of them, on a considerable variety of subjects, more than I could mention here. Finally, we reach the 21st century. Fragmentation has gone even further. Instead of 2 cultures of knowledge, there was a great debate in Britain and elsewhere in the 1950s, 1960s about the 2 cultures and the non-communication between them. But now, many more cultures. Increasing specialization threatens communication between different kinds of scientists even. One critic, a Cambridge physicist who became a historian of science, called specialization a process of knowing more and more about less and less. And he called the book he wrote about this problem, Knowing Everything About Nothing. So, yet again, one might have expected the polymath to have become extinct, along with so many other species in the world today. And yet, there are a few remarkable living individuals who've continued to resist the pressures to specialize, apparently with success. This is the American Jared Diamond. He makes a very good example of the serial polymath. His first discipline was physiology. He became professor of physiology in the University of California at Los Angeles. From physiology moving into biology, he became particularly interested in birds. In pursuit of the study of birds, he went to New Guinea. In New Guinea, this man of great curiosity started to take an interest first in languages, because many different languages are spoken in New Guinea in a relatively small area. He became interested in anthropology. He became interested in geography. And finally, ecology and history. I think one might say that in the today, Diamond is most widely known as the author of a book on comparative history called Guns, Germs and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies. He tells us himself the reason he wrote the book was that he was talking to a man in New Guinea, and the man said to him, "How is it that the West is so rich and we in New Guinea are so poor? Is it our fault?" And in order to explain the different evolution of different societies in the world, Diamond ended up writing this book. Another remarkable example of a polymath today, another Brazilian one, Roberto Mangabeira Unga, who's made original contributions to philosophy and law and economics. Maybe other subjects, but those ones for sure. He was one of the founders of the movement known as critical legal studies, which rejects the idea that laws are neutral, examines them, like a sociologist, I would say, as expressions of the power of particular groups. But not satisfied with a breakthrough in one discipline, the next book he published was a critique of classical economics, Free Trade Reimagined. And a few living polymaths have become famous not only because of the range of their interests, but also their ability to represent themselves in the media, especially appearing on television. I'm thinking particularly of a philosopher who does not confine himself to philosophy. I'm pausing deliberately, hoping that you're going to guess who it is. Anyway, it is Slavoj Žižek, who is, or at least was, a Marxist philosopher from Slovenia. He was recently described as having written about, I quote, global capitalism, psychoanalysis, opera, totalitarianism, cognitive science, racism, human rights, religion, new media, popular culture, cinema, love, ethics, environmentalism, New Age philosophy, and politics. I have to add that, rather like Athanasius Kircher, Žižek has often been described as a charlatan. Whether or not that is the case, I'm afraid I'm not enough of a polymath to assess his contribution to these various fields. And I also want to say that accusations of this kind may be described as an occupational hazard for polymaths. Because their interests are broad, people are inevitably going to say that they lack depth. It's going to be said they're so much in a hurry to move on to new disciplines that they don't really master the old ones. On some occasions, I'm sure the accusation is right. On other occasions, it isn't. You have to look at each case on its own terms. But that last point raises a general question, and I want to end by talking about this general question. How do they do it? What makes certain individuals able to outwit specialization and to master these disciplines even in the world of today? And I think the answer lies in a combination of psychological qualities and access to a certain kind of social niche that gives them the opportunity to perform. So first of all, the psychological side. Polymaths obviously need an overdose of curiosity, a real drive to learn. Two of them, at least, in the 20th century, are known to have read the Encyclopedia Britannica. That is, they didn't just consult it. They opened it at the beginning and they read it through. One of them is Burke, now famous for his short stories. If he died at the age of 40, he'd not published a single short story. He would have been famous for his essays on a whole variety of subjects. Anyway, he went to the Biblioteca Nacional in Buenos Aires, and while he was waiting for a book to be brought to him, he picked the Encyclopedia Britannica off the shelf. He says this himself in an interview, just reading it. And the other man is an Englishman, Aldous Huxley, now only remembered as a novelist, but also a wide-ranging essayist. Polymaths usually have an overdose of energy. Many of them are workaholics. They also need, I think, the capacity to concentrate their attention. One moment on one topic, an hour later on something else. And this capacity is often misunderstood by observers who call them absent-minded. Well, of course, their mind is absent very often from everyday life, but it's extremely present working on a particular problem. I'm not sure whether they need to be competitive, but it's clear that many polymaths are fiercely competitive. Newton and Leibniz, for example, were great rivals, and each of them believed that they had discovered calculus and the other simply stole the idea. These psychological qualities may be timeless, but different cultures either encourage them or discourage them. Some Christians believe that curiosity is a sin, but others, particularly Protestants, or Calvinists at least, they emphasize the work ethic and the need not to waste time. Both of these qualities are crucial for polymaths. You may remember the idea of the Protestant ethic. This was put forward by Max Weber, and this was his explanation of the rise of capitalism. Hard work and thrift led to the accumulation of capital. In my view, the Protestant ethic also encourages polymaths. A remarkable number of them from the 19th and 20th centuries were brought up as Protestants. And very often they were the sons or occasionally the daughters of Protestant pastors. Weber himself makes a good example of my argument. He's now remembered as a founding father of sociology. He was also a historian, an economist, and a philosopher. He was also a workaholic, and his mother was a pious Calvinist. Well, so much for the psychological side. But if you can't find a social niche in which to operate, then your qualities are not going to bear fruit. Now, the problem today, finding such a niche is becoming increasingly difficult in our world. But to go back, Alexander von Humboldt, he never had any employment. He was rich enough to spend his life as an independent scholar. He was rich enough to finance his own expedition to South America without having to go to any foundation and write out forms applying for funds. a number of 19th century scholars began to publish on different subjects only after they'd received a legacy and no longer had to specialize. Again, Sor Juana was a nun, and in the case of females, until the late 19th century, only nuns and widows had the leisure for study. But today, there are fewer nuns, and in any case, they're expected to do social work rather than to study and learn as much as Sor Juana did in her cell, equipped with all those books that you saw in the picture. Another niche is now disappearing. A considerable number of polymaths, from Leibniz to Borges, have been employed as librarians. It's wonderful. You sit in a library, you have immediate access to books on every subject. But librarianship has become professionalized. To become a librarian, you need a training in something like management. You're not expected, maybe you're not even given the time to read the books of which you are the custodian. Turning to universities, for a long time they have been a niche for polymaths. In the 17th century, in German universities, if you became a professor in one subject, there was absolutely no problem in giving lectures on other subjects. In the 19th century, you were expected only to lecture in your faculty on your specialization. But for a long time, some universities at least were flexible, and supposing that a professor changed interests, that he was a serial polymath, arrangements could be made. In England, a Hungarian refugee, Michael Polanyi, was professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester. One day he went to the vice-chancellor, that is the equivalent of the rector. He said, "I'm not so interested in chemistry anymore, and what I really want to do is to study philosophy." So they just moved him along the campus and changed his name to Professor of Philosophy and accommodated him. Similarly with Jared Diamond. He spent his whole academic career at the University of California at Los Angeles, first in the Department of Physiology, and today, if he's not retired, I'm not sure because you don't have to retire in the States, but his last job is in the Department of Geography. But universities are becoming less hospitable to this eccentric type of scholar. And in any case, as you all know, there are more and more committees, more and more administration. One doesn't have the time to keep up with one's own subject, let alone invade the territories of all one's colleagues. Again, from the 19th century onwards, an important niche for polymaths was the journal, or even the newspaper, in which they were able to publish articles on a wide variety of subjects. Sometimes they were so well paid that they could live by this rather than taking a more specialist job. In the 19th century, Victorian Britain was a home of these general journals like the Edinburgh Review, Westminster Review, in which leading intellectuals, they could publish long articles on whatever happened to interest them. In France, the same thing with the Revue des Deux Mondes. This, in the United States, in the 20th century, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books. Susan Sontag made a living after she left the academic world by writing for the New York Review of Books. But today, these journals are going through a crisis, losing readers, losing advertising. They may survive in online versions, but who wants to read an article of 20 pages online. So, and if people read it on screen, they won't read it so carefully. So, and even that niche is disappearing. So, almost miraculously, polymaths survived two crises of knowledge, one in the 17th century, the other in the 19th. And today, we and they face a third crisis, provoked in part at least by the digital revolution, leading to information overload on a more spectacular scale than ever before, so much so that new units of measurement have to be invented to calculate it. Exabytes, for example, and now exabytes are not big enough, and you have zettabytes. How can mere humans handle all this information? Now, there have been many different regimes of knowledge in world history. It might be argued that polymaths belong to an old regime that is obsolete or obsolescent. I mentioned 3 living polymaths in the last few minutes, but they've all left middle age behind. Jared Diamond is 80. Roberto Unger is 70. Zizek is 68. They're too old, like me, to feel the full effects of the third crisis. I can't think of any polymath living who was born after the year 1950. I hope that this is simply deficiency in my knowledge, because if it isn't, we have a problem. So I end this lecture with a question that I can't answer. Will the digital generation produce polymaths? I certainly hope so. We certainly need them. Within the current division of intellectual labor, we need generalists, because they're the ones who can remedy the problem of fragmentation. They're the ones who can see the connections between apparently distant fields of knowledge. And the problem is that society is making life more and more difficult for members of this species. So it's a paradox. At the very moment we need them most, we are making it more difficult for them to appear. Multidisciplinarity is a fashionable term, but we ought to remember the words of Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon is another remarkable member of this species. I think it's correct to say he is the only individual who has won a Nobel Prize in economics without ever spending any time in a faculty of economics. He began his academic career teaching in a faculty of political science. And then he moved on to cognitive psychology because he was interested in decision-making. From cognitive psychology, he moved into computer science. Publishing from time to time articles on mathematics and physics just for fun. Anyway, Simon criticized the idea that you should bring different kinds of social scientists together to work as a team. He thought these attempts at teamwork had never produced satisfactory results. What was needed, according to Simon, was bringing the different social sciences together in the head of a single individual. It worked in the past, worked for Simon, but will it work in the future? I'm sorry to say, I don't know. Thank you.
Bom, nós temos tempo para dirigir algumas perguntas ao nosso convidado e vamos fazê-lo da seguinte maneira. Vamos pedir que as pessoas se dirijam aqui à frente e façam a pergunta por escrito, por favor, porque o nosso convidado pediu que as perguntas fossem feitas por escrito para facilitar a sua compreensão. Tá? Vamos proceder dessa maneira, então? Então, as pessoas que se interessarem em dirigir alguma pergunta ao nosso convidado, por favor, levantem a mão, podem se aproximar. Ou dirigir por escrito. Pode vir aqui, por favor. Dirigir alguma pergunta por escrito, que nós vamos passar para o professor Peter Burke, e aí ele responde.
Do you consider the excessive emphasis on results, economic or curricular products, to be another obstacle for polymaths? Yes, that's simple. I'm quite sure that an emphasis on results in the short term is an obstacle for polymaths, because it takes time, and you can't master all the disciplines at once. So you can't expect a polymath to produce results quickly. But after 20 years, maybe you begin to see you have to have confidence in them. Any society or culture which demands quick results rules out the possibility of these other important results.
This is in Portuguese.
Há uma passagem em que Burke diz que a história cultural ficou velha. É possível ainda falar em história cultural hoje. I was lucky enough to belong to a generation when cultural history became popular, one might even say fashionable, just at the time that I was writing books about it. In my view, cultural history is becoming gradually a bit less popular because, as you know, the academic world is a world of competition, and the rise of other approaches to history are maybe pushing cultural history out of the limelight. I'm thinking in particular of the history of the environment. I should say, I don't think this is a bad thing. I think I am all in favor of the history of the environment. I don't think it's bad if it expands its empire, and that means that the empire of cultural history shrinks a bit. I would be worried if cultural history disappeared. I think we need this approach because there need to be historians who study the world of symbols as well as the world of people earning a living, engaging in politics, reacting to the challenges facing the planet, and so on. So it may be that its golden age has becoming a silver age, but it's certainly still possible to speak and write about cultural history. Why not Noam Chomsky? Yeah, I couldn't talk about many people I would like to have talked about, and I certainly include Chomsky as a polymath, even though he has two different reputations. So he has his specialist reputation as a theoretical linguist, and then he has his general reputation for his interventions in politics. He doesn't have the range of the living polymaths and the other 21st century polymaths that I mentioned. If I had had the time to mention one more individual, alas, no longer living, I would have chosen Umberto Eco. It is incredible the range of topics on which Eco wrote. He had a weekly column in an Italian daily newspaper, L'Espresso, and one day he would write about the Red Brigades, the next day about Candomblé, the next time it would be about the Middle Ages, the time after that about cell phones, and so on, and so on. I think it's quite incredible that he could write so clearly, so accessibly about such a variety of subjects. If I had the choice of being one of the polymaths who have already existed, I would choose Eco over Chomsky. Como o professor veio o movimento de integrative learning que vem ocorrendo nas universidades. Esse movimento pode ajudar na formação de novos polimatas. Yeah, unfortunately, although I know that the phrase integrative learning, I don't know anything about it. I don't know how, as a means of education, it differs from other means. It reminds me, though, of my first years of teaching in the new university in England, which was founded flying the banner of interdisciplinarity. But so the fundamental idea of the University of Sussex was to find a happy middle way between the traditional English style that the students specialized in one discipline and the American system, which the founders of the university called fairly or unfairly the cafeteria system, in which the students could combine any course with any other course, however unconnected they might be. The ideal in Sussex was that you major in one discipline. 50% of your time went on that. But you did not have a free choice for the other 50%. So you could read history in the School of European Studies, and that meant you studied not only history, but some European philosophy, some European literature. But if you read history in the School of African and Asian Studies, then you needed to read history combined with some anthropology and economics or politics. And this, in other words, students moved outside their major subject, but always to study something that was connected with it in order for integration. I certainly believe that that this is likely to help produce polymaths. But I have to say, I had some extremely bright students at Sussex in the 1960s. Some of them have had distinguished academic careers. None of them, to my knowledge, has become a polymath. Yeah. Could you please talk about the political uses of knowledge? I'm thinking specifically about a rhetoric of expertise used to legitimate certain policies, often in an anti-democratic manner. Could polymaths work as an antidote to that? Well, I think many people could work as an antidote to that from the perspective of particular disciplines, political science, but also the study of rhetoric, one of the oldest disciplines in universities. but since it would be possible for a polymath to combine contributions to both rhetoric and politics, if they existed, they would be the ideal people to act as an antidote in that way. Do you see some advantage or something good in the fragmentation of knowledge, in the department specialization, and in the digital revolution we live today? Well, as I suggested at one point, I do not oppose specialization. I think specialization has led to many valuable discoveries. And I certainly am not against the digital revolution. I am, like everybody else, a beneficiary of the digital revolution, reading texts that have been digitized and are accessible where I live, rather than making me travel many miles to find a particular manuscript in a particular library. But this is a rather banal reflection on life, I think. But every benefit turns out, sooner or later, to have some cost. Just as every solution to a problem, sooner or later, is going to produce a problem in its turn. And this is the case with specialization. That the pressure to specialize rose as a response to a problem, too much to know. And then it produced a problem, lack of connection. These things are to be expected, but then, of course, we have to work out how to solve the new problem, knowing in advance that whatever solution we produce, sooner or later, it will produce yet another problem. That's life. Do you know about Charles Munger? I'm afraid no. If yes, how do you see his multidisciplinary approach on creating a lattice work of mental models? Well, since I don't know about him, I can't comment about him, but I can say that a polymath I know a little about, flourishing in the middle of the 20th century, called Donald Campbell. Originally a social psychologist, but he branched into neighboring disciplines. And he had a phrase which I like, just as I like the lattice work. Campbell's phrase was, wait a minute, I had it a moment ago, now I'm losing the word. Oh yeah, the fish scale model of interdisciplinarity. Fish scale because the scales overlap. They don't coincide, but they overlap. So part of each specialization has something important in common with the neighboring specialization. And that enables the clustered polymath to operate. So I imagine that Charles Munger is saying something similar, but alas, I don't know. Quando o professor chama as polimatas de espécie, não estariam os polimatas, então, em uma categoria de especialização. Well, as I think I was saying, in the 17th century, it was the last period that it was still normal to be a polymath. But some people were much better at it than others. They mastered more disciplines than others. And then in the 19th century, I was suggesting, actually it was not me who was suggesting it, it was Auguste Comte, another great polymath who devoted himself to reclassifying knowledge. And of course, you can't reclassify knowledge without studying all subjects. And he was the one who said, in a world of specialization, a word that he was one of the first to use, if not the first to use in French, polymaths have indeed become a kind of specialist. They specialize in generalities. Como podemos tratar a produção de produtos dentro do mundo acadêmico? Quando, na verdade, a produção é feita para satisfazer o ego do intelectual, mais que verdadeiro retorno à sociedade. I have to say that I don't agree with this contrast between past and present. I'm sorry to say that I believe that, just as I believe that many polymaths are competitive, I do think that often egoism is an important part of their personality and linked to their drive to know more and more and to show other people that they know more than the other people do. But a side effect, a consequence may be unintended of this egoism, is something that's valuable to society. I don't think that this is a contradiction. It's a paradox, but it's a paradox that occurs not only in the field of knowledge, but in other fields. I don't think people would enter politics if they hadn't got larger egos than usual, but all the same, some politicians, I don't know what percentage, carry out actions which really are beneficial to many people. So the question is a rather general one. Yes, José Bonifácio foi importante geologista e mineralogista do século XIX. Com a descoberta do lítio e a erradicação da malária por Lisboa. No entanto, pela historiografia, vimos como estadista e tutor do imperador brasileiro e esquecemos do seu caráter científico pela Europa. Podemos considerá-lo como polímata ou generalista. Yeah, I'm quite sure. I may, for my own purposes, since I'm writing a cultural history of polymaths, I have been attempting a collective biography of 500 polymaths, and I'm happy to say that José Bonifácio is one of this 500. And he also illustrates very well a point I made near the beginning, which is, in our specialized culture, we remember past polymaths for only a small proportion of their achievements. So we think that Leibniz was just a philosopher, and we think that José Bonifácio was just a politician. But of course, that is our narrowness and not theirs.
This is in English.
Okay. Glad people are showing such interest. Currently, the study of different subjects is often seen as leisure in a pejorative sense, mere leisure. In a way, the very Protestant ethic of hard work could be perhaps undermining the polymath's emergence. In that sense, what's the correlation between the art of studying in its ludic, perhaps artistic dimension, and the development of broader studies and of polymaths themselves? There's another question, but I try to answer that before I move down the page. Yeah, I think there's a very interesting interplay between work and play in scholarship in general and in polymathy in particular. I ended the lecture talking about Herbert Simon. He admitted he was a workaholic. He was from a Protestant family, but he talked about his contributions to mathematics and physics. He said, I did them just for fun. It was so easy for him to master these different disciplines that he could do it with joy. So there's no necessary incompatibility. Maybe for some of us, we can't get ahead academically without working harder than we would have liked to. But some lucky people, they can have fun and at the same time they have achievements. Second question on the same page. Is it possible to think of polymaths within one specific field? For instance, historians who work simultaneously with a wide array of topics such as ancient history, modern history, cultural history, political history, etc. Yeah, exactly my sentiments. Something I will say in the book, but I didn't have time to talk about it today. I have to say, though, it's become increasingly rare to find historians who move happily from one period to another. It was quite normal in the 19th century. In Oxford, in the 1960s, when I was still a student, my research supervisor was Hugh Trevor Roper. He was one of the very few living British historians at the time who published on both the 17th century and the 20th. Wrote one book about Hitler, but most of the time he was studying the 17th century. There were a few other cases. Eric Hobsbawm, in the 1960s, was best known as an economic historian of the 17th century, and later became more famous as a social and cultural historian of the 19th century, and finally wrote about the 20th. But I hate to say it's a dying breed, but that kind of historian is much rarer today than it was 100 or 200 years ago.
This is the last one.
Right. Nation Gitanos. The Gypsies, like a polymath movement, migration and freedom, values on constant fixation, public policy. Is it possible to talk about polymath like freedom lifestyle, to increase a discussion on a theory of knowledge? Well, yeah, polymaths have to have a certain lifestyle. They have not only to have a lot of energy and a lot of curiosity. I would agree they have to feel free. That is, many scholars, intellectuals today, I think, accept the division into specialities almost as if it was a fact of nature. So, having decided to study economics, then they don't read books about politics or sociology. But some other people have that sense of freedom. All right, maybe I'm going to make my career as an economist. That's not going to stop me reading books on other subjects. And who knows, maybe that would give me a new vision of economics. So these two kinds of personality coexist in the academic field, and the one with the greater sense of freedom, the scholar gypsy, to quote a 19th century English polymath, Matthew Arnold, those are the ones that are most likely to end up achieving something in different disciplines.
Bom, ok, já tivemos uma boa rodada de umas 10 perguntas, creio eu. Queria, então, prosseguindo para concluir, finalizar os trabalhos dessa manhã, agradecer mais uma vez. I thank you, Professor Burke, on behalf of our institution for having accepted our invitation and having given this very important lecture for us, to share your time, your critical view, and also your wisdom with us. Eu gostaria, mais uma vez, de reforçar o convite para quinta-feira, a palestra da professora Maria Lúcia Palhares Burke, neste mesmo auditório e horário, e agradecer a professora Juliana Gamboge também por nos auxiliar nos trabalhos e ter sugerido, uma das pessoas que sugeriu o convite ao professor Burke e à professora Maria Lúcia. Então, mais uma vez, eu agradeço em nome da universidade e solicitaria aos presentes que nós agradecêssemos da forma usual ao professor Peter Burke por ter nos prestigiado com a sua presença e com a palestra. Muito obrigado, professor.